You're listening to the Place Northwest podcast, your digital resource for the latest insight and analysis on all things property in the northwest of England.
Hello and welcome to this Place Northwest podcast. I'm your host, Dan Whelan. Today's episode is sponsored by Kuits. Kuits is an award-winning independent law firm based in Manchester city centre. The firm has an extensive property department with expertise and experience in working with big-name property developers, construction, landlord and tenant, and planning clients. Today we are taking a whistle-stop tour through the world of permitted development rights. We will explore what permitted development is, why it exists, and how it could impact the future of our high streets amid changing consumer trends. Joining me to discuss all that and much more are Victoria Leam, solicitor at Kuits, and Justine Entezari, associate at Iceni Projects. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Hello.
Great to have you on. We'll get started. We'll dive straight in because there's a lot to cover today. Victoria, I'll come to you first. And I was hoping you could give us a sort of a layman's description of what permitted development is, if you could, please.
Yes, of course. It's a really good place to start. So, permitted development, in essence, it's just development that doesn't need planning permission. When it was very, very first brought in as a concept, it was only ever aimed at really small scale development. So, for example, householder applications that had no or little impact on neighbours. And the idea of this was to take small scale development outside of the planning system so that the larger applications could actually get through in a bit of a quicker time and it wasn't bogged down by the small stuff.
Okay, that's really interesting. And so I guess brought in for things like adding a conservatory to the back of your house, but as we'll hear later on, it's developed and gone on from there. Justine, is there anything you want to add to what Victoria just said about PD?
Yeah, sure. I think it's just probably worth mentioning that the rules are really complicated. I guess ideally, if something's permitted, you'd probably assume you could just kind of crack on with the development, but it's often not the case. Even just reading and interpreting the regulations can be really tricky. They're definitely not user friendly. And Victoria's probably the same, but I always absolutely panic when someone asks me for advice on the PD regs for their house extension, just in case I get something wrong. And you'd think those would be kind of the most straightforward, regulations, really. I guess, as Victoria said already, some permitted developments do still require an application process, which is called prior approval. And this essentially allows the local planning authority to consider the proposals in relation to a kind of specific list of criteria. And the list of criteria differs depending on the particular type of permitted development, if you're still with me. So although the principle of the development might be permitted, you could basically still be turned down on grounds such as like flooding or transport, for example.
Right, okay, so it's not an easy pass to get something through. In fact, far from it. It sounds like it can sometimes be more complicated than a full planning application.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say that it's often quite a similar process to a full planning application, which in some ways kind of makes you wonder what the point of it is in a way, because sometimes the requirements are so stringent that you end up submitting almost a full planning application, but it's called a prior approval application. And there's still an 8-week determination period before which you can't commence the development. So it's quite similar, yeah.
I think it's also really useful to remember that for an application for prior approval, it can be approved or refused just as an application for planning permission can be. So, yeah, I think there are quite a lot of elements where it really is akin to a planning permission or a planning application.
Yeah, so like you said before, Victoria, this was brought in to try and ease the burden on local planning authorities, I guess, so that they didn't have to trawl through full applications. But as it's progressed over the years, it seems that it's, like you said, Justine, just defeating the point of having it because it seems like just as much work anyway. But moving on from that, but very well explained, thank you both. One, you mentioned, Justine, there's lots of different types of permitted development. One of them is office to resi. Why did that come about, Victoria?
Right, yeah. So in 2013, the Conservative government were desperate to increase housing numbers, as is probably a really, really common theme these days. It's all a lack of affordable housing and, lack of housing numbers. People can't get on the housing ladder. And so the government came up with using sort of the existing principle of permitted development in a bid to boost those housing numbers. And so what they decided to do was bring underused or vacant offices, of which at that point there were quite a few knocking around in the country. They decided that they would bring those back into use and actually kill two birds with one stone by using them for residential. And I don't know if you remember Eric Pickles, the larger than life character who was the Secretary of State in 2013. He
Mhm.
said that the whole point of this office to Resi in 2013 was to provide badly needed homes, help create jobs in the construction and service industries, and help regenerate our town centres. And I think that's really important because, as we're going to discuss later, the focus now is on um, residential development and the reinvigoration of town centres. But actually, even back in 2013, that reinvigoration was kind of a requirement, and that's obviously a long time before COVID.
Mm.
I think what's really interesting with the 2013 introduction, which was a temporary right in the first place, it was immediately incredibly popular. And I think the government really, really underestimated exactly how popular it would be. And in the first 3 months of these new rights coming into force, there were 1,000 applications to the district councils across the country. And in the previous 10 years, there are the actual applications, planning applications for office to residential had only been in the hundreds. So you can
Wow.
really see the difference. Um, and it was a temporary right to start with, and then it proved so popular that they actually decided to make it into a permanent right, and it's been permanent ever since. And its popularity is, I suppose, evidenced by the fact that there's over 50,000 new homes that actually have been created from these office to residential conversions.
Okay.
Um, I think one final point to make in respect of the office to residential, um, it's always really crucial to remember that those permitted development rights only actually covered the change of use. So if you needed to do any external works, or in planning terms, operational development, you actually then still had to apply for planning permission to do that. So this PD right is only for the change of use from the office to the residential use.
Okay, excellent. I'm glad you mentioned change of use there because that's something else we're going to talk about later. So overall, has that office to resi permitted development right been successful, would you say, Justine? What have been the positives and the negatives with that?
I think, in terms of the number of new homes that have been brought forward in this way, I think it's estimated to be around 6% on a national basis of all new homes coming forward through these sorts of permitted development rights.
Hmm.
So, although that probably doesn't sound drastic, some areas have seen none at all, while others have seen, a huge amount of housing coming forward like this. And I think it's probably fair to say the policy's been significantly more popular in the south and less so in the north, because there's fewer areas with the kind of two ingredients of a surplus of office accommodation and also a demand for apartment living in the same area. Manchester has also had a kind of specific policy called an Article 4 direction, which has prevented office to residential conversions in the city centre.
Right.
But one area that has seen significant take-up is Trafford.
Okay.
So I think in Trafford, in the last financial year, there was about over 57% of new houses delivered in this way, which is obviously a significant number. And I suppose that Trafford is an area that kind of ticks both the boxes in terms of having lots of kind of fairly outdated office buildings who might be, they might be struggling to compete with neighbouring developments, for example, in Salford Quays. And there's also a buoyant local housing market. So in some ways it could be seen as a success for somewhere like Trafford, and particularly for areas like Old Trafford, because it's potentially a good thing to bring residents into an area that was previously dominated by poor quality offices. And that might also mean that the remaining offices are higher quality, and then they can attract better tenants.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned Trafford there. There's one PDR scheme going on at the moment. Investar Property Group are converting Paragon House, which was previously a Bruntwood office building. Interesting what you said about the Article 4 directive in Manchester City Centre blocking this kind of development. Victoria, I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about the quality of these conversions. They were offices, they're being turned to resi. Are they good quality? Would you want to live there?
Well, I think what has been really, really prominent in the press discussions of office to resi since they were brought in is exactly that. It's the quality of those conversions. So much so that the government actually commissioned a review of the quality standards of these new homes delivered through office to residential PD rights. And a small minority of developers were found to have possibly exploited the permitted development system. And the review concluded that worse quality residential environments than planning permission conversions in relation to a number of factors widely linked to the health, well-being and quality of life of future occupiers were found. Now, in terms of the standards, I think that the government must have thought that the free market would take care of the quality of these conversions, because who on earth would want to live in a small, poky, dark house? But what I think the government failed to take into account was the desperation of people to get on the housing ladder, to buy their own houses. And actually, people, particularly in the south, were just so desperate, or really, really wanted to buy these conversions. And the result has been that some poor quality conversions exist. So what they've done, the government, to sort of curtail or curtail the minority of developers who might try to take advantage and improve or upgrade the housing stock, was actually they brought in two requirements over the last 6 months, one of which is for light in habitable rooms. And the other one, which is quite interesting, is a minimum space now, which is office to residential now has to be at least 37 square meters. Now that's still obviously not huge, but I think it's probably also a good indicator of how small the ones that are not 37 square meters actually are. I think it's also really, really interesting to think about that these office to residential conversions were brought about to meet a need for housing, particularly for starter homes, small homes, for people just leaving university, etc. But there's no requirement with office to residential for there to be affordable housing.
Right.
And I think that's really, really interesting. The local government association actually said that last year the office to residential conversions had actually caused the loss of 13,500 affordable homes in the last 4 years alone. Now, my clients are commonly the traditional house builders, not particularly those who are doing the office to residential conversions. And my clients might say that they, in some ways, are paying the price for a lack of affordable housing in these office to residential, because the local councils still have affordable housing targets to meet.
Right.
And so when traditional house builders are applying for planning permission in more traditional, urban areas and suburbs, I wonder if they are then facing a higher affordable housing target, say of around 40%, to almost make up for the office to residential shortfall. I
Right.
think is a really, but it's important to note that even though some developers have provided poor quality dwellings, there really has been an awful lot of good stuff as well, and I don't think we should lose sight of that. It has done some good.
Absolutely. And just going back briefly to the affordable element, is it viable for these schemes? Would they stack up if they had to also provide an affordable element, say 10%? Do you think that could be easily implemented?
I'm not sure, actually. I think now that the minimum space standards and the right to light has been brought in, I know that there's already been murmurs within the property industry that those two requirements alone are going to impact on the viability.
Okay.
And I do wonder if there was an affordable requirement, which I know has a really big impact on large housing schemes, that you're building from scratch. Um, I do wonder actually if that would then knock it from viable into unviable, which
Hmm.
might well be the reason that the government didn't actually request that in the first place.
I suppose the other thing, just to note on that, is that different areas have different affordable housing requirements. So I don't think a blanket kind of 10% approach would work. It would have to
No.
be locally set, and then
Hmm.
it just would be some debate as to how you put that into, a national government policy.
Okay, absolutely. Okay, moving on. There's been some changes made to permitted development rights recently, but before we delve into that, I want to go back to the change of use issue that was brought up before. Um, Victoria, can you explain where the new use class E comes into everything that we've been talking about so far and what it means to developers?
Yes, of course. So last September brought about possibly one of the biggest shake-ups to the planning system, and in particularly to the use class order that's ever been seen. And use class E is a new commercial business and service class. It's got lots and lots of different uses within that use class E. So that includes retail, sale of food and drink on the premises, financial services, indoor sports, nurseries, offices, and also light industrial. So light industrial where there wouldn't be any impact on the neighbouring amenity. Um, just to to illustrate what this means for property owners is that uses that were previously in a different class, such as shops or gyms, are now going to be within the same class. And so those property owners can actually now change between, for example, offices and cafes without applying for planning permission. Um, it's a little bit of a tricky concept to explain, but it is important to remember that moving within the same class, so moving within a use that's in class E, is not development. Moving between classes, so for example from class E to class C, which I know we're going to come on to, is classed as development. Um, we've got the planning bill that's coming up that was announced in the Queen's speech last month. And that one of the really primary aims of the planning bill is to shake up, modernise and streamline the planning system. And I do feel that this introduction of Class E is possibly that first tentative step into, a real shake-up that's to follow. Um, I mean, even before COVID hit, there were a lot of pre-existing sort of socio-economic issues and vacant buildings in town centres. And so I know that our clients at Kites have certainly welcomed Class E and the flexibility that, it affords them to use a vacant property or an underused property for a different use.
Okay, excellent. So just to clarify for myself and for the listeners, so at the moment, a shop to a gym. So shops used to be one class, gyms used to be another class. They now both fall under Class E. And to
Yes,
change a shop to a gym, that's fine. You can do that under the new rules.
yes, that's correct, because it's both
Perfect.
within Class E, so it's not development.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. So the changes, we've spoken about Class E. We'll talk now about the changes to permitted development rules recently. Justine, I'll throw back to you on this. Could you touch on a few of those things?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So before we kind of launch into the proposed changes to permitted development rights, it's which will allow use class E to convert to residential. And I think that's the key one that people are talking about. It's probably just worth mentioning that there are a couple of other significant changes as well, which came in last year. Probably, to be honest, they could warrant a separate podcast. So I'm not going to go into too much detail. But there are seven new permitted development rights, which basically allow different forms of upward extensions and redevelopments to create residential development. So one of the upward extension rules will allow up to 2 stories of new apartments to be developed above existing apartment blocks or mixed-use buildings. Which will, open up lots of opportunities, I think. And another one, which is the new Class ZA, also allows vacant, purpose-built blocks of flats or offices to be demolished and replaced with a new residential apartment scheme. And this has to be on the same footprint as the existing building, but it can be up to 2 stories taller. So that probably sounds quite radical.
Yeah, it does. It really does. Yeah.
But there are just a caveat that there are lots of kind of specific situations in which the rules don't apply, and there's also a really long list of matters for prior approval, like things like heritage, contamination, design, landscaping, etc. So I think, again, like we said before, you'll probably see prior approval applications that are just as complicated and detailed as planning applications on those.
Right. So any developer sort of eyeing up an empty office block and wanting to knock it down, don't get too excited because it's going to be a planning nightmare, basically, is the advice. But yeah, it does seem pretty radical, especially given, the sustainability drive. Demolishing buildings and rebuilding them is not good for the planet, is it? And to make this, in theory, an easier thing to do seems a little bit odd. Victoria, let's come to you. Class E to Resi, Justine touched on it there. What is it, please?
So this is the hot topic of the moment, particularly as it's going to be coming into force at the start of August this year. It was the consultation for this was introduced, I think 6 months at the end of last year, 6 months ago, and there was an awful lot of pushback for the change from Class E to Class C3, which is residential. And so what's actually coming into force at the start of August is slightly watered down from the suggested free-for-all that was consulted upon. So, for example, things that they've put into place that weren't in the initial consultation was a size limit to introduce the change to 1,500 square metres. And so that naturally will fall upon quite a lot of our clients who have medium-sized buildings rather than those who own the really, really large properties. So yes, it's from August this year, you'll be able to go from Class E to Class C, and it's almost a natural successor to the office to residential. And if you think about it logically, because offices will, no longer exist, there'd be the old B1. From the 1st of August, the transitional provisions actually run out. So we're going to have to start using, the new use classes from the 1st of August this year. It's had to be replaced, or not had to, but it's a natural successor, this Class E to Class C. There are an awful lot of hurdles to jump, as Justine's been touching upon. So, for example, the Class E use must have been in continuous use for 2 years before benefiting from this PD right, and the property itself must have been vacant for 3 months before the application for prior approval is made. Importantly, I think for a lot of businesses, the COVID-related closures don't count for that. So if you've got a property owner who's had to close down their business, such as a cafe, during the lockdowns, that actually doesn't count towards this period of vacancy. I think what's really, really interesting is that the regulations actually have part of a building is able to be changed under these new rules. So you could actually have the ground floor of a Class C building changing to residential or the upper floors, as long as you don't hit that 1,500 square metre limit. So I think that's going to be a really attractive element, that you don't actually have to change everything. One other really interesting point is that, differently to the office to residential, the new rights actually apply in conservation areas. And I think a lot of people might be surprised to actually learn that conservation areas are not just for, areas of beauty or the green belt. A lot of town centres are actually conservation areas. For example, Manchester city centre is actually made up of a patchwork of lots of different conservation areas. And so this Class E to residential will still apply in those conservation areas. One important thing I think for both Justine and Kuits clients to remember is that you can still apply for the office to residential conversions up to the 31st of July this year. So I think everybody was expecting a real rush for people to get in. Those people who still owned the office blocks that were suitable for conversion, before the right is actually replaced by a similar, very, very similar, but much more stringent permitted development right. And as I mentioned as well, that the 31st of July is the end of the transitional provisions. And so for the last year, even though we've had, since the new use classes came in at the start of September, we've still been referring to, for PD rights and change of uses, the old Class A, Class B, Class C. Now everything going forward will be referred to by the new use class references.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. So in principle, if we look at the state of retail and the high street, empty units, etc., this new permitted development right of Class E to Resi seems like a good idea in principle, but the reaction has been mixed, shall we say. We wrote an article when it was first announced in April, and we had RICS, REBA, various other organisations slamming the proposals. They said that without the usual checks and balances provided by the planning system, there is a risk that the new rules could harm communities, concerns about poor quality housing. It made for pretty grim reading, but as you said, Victoria, things have been watered down slightly since then. Justine, what's your take on this, and how do you envisage it working, if at all?
Well, in terms of the industry response, I think there was a consultation held at the end of last year, and as you say, I think the response has been mixed, veering towards negative. And I think just one really important thing to note before we all get too excited about all the new rules is that there's actually a campaign group called Rights Community Action, who are in the thick of challenging the government's introduction of Youth Class E and the new proposed changes to permitted development rights. So they did initially bring a JR review claim to the High Court, but they were turned down last year. But just this week, they've been granted the right to appeal against the decision. So I suppose we'll be watching with interest to see, what unfolds there. Mm-hmm. And they're kind of concerned that the new rights are not sustainable or democratic, and that they could have, a significantly detrimental impact on housing standards and the high street. So, as you say, that kind of, reflects what the professional bodies are saying as well. Could this be the nail in the coffin for high streets that are already struggling, essentially? The government should be surely supporting the remaining high street businesses at the moment and not kind of opening them up to a change to residential where that use would have a higher value. I guess other people that are against the proposals are the Local Government Association. They've again flagged the fact that there'll be no affordable housing requirements, and that the new rules will essentially undermine development plans. What's the point in councils planning where housing should go if it's then just going to be in the all over the town centres, etc., unplanned? So I guess although the government are not looking to reverse the proposals, we know they've been watered down a bit, as Victoria's kind of touched upon. In particular, bringing in the 1,500 square metre conversion and the 3-month vacancy period. But it's not, it's not a massively drastic change, I wouldn't say. They are still ploughing on. And despite the feedback, we're still going to see no affordable housing requirement, although the development will be still liable. There's also, I think, something you mentioned before, Dan, just about the government's kind of sustainability drive. There's also no particular sustainability or energy standards to comply with. So how is that, going to help us get towards our zero carbon future? We don't know yet.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, I mean, the affordable housing element is a concern, obviously, and I think everyone would agree it'd be better if there was an element of affordable included in this. But as you know, these organisational bodies have these concerns. As we mentioned at the very start of the podcast, sometimes getting permission to carry out a permitted development right can be as labour intensive and as heavily scrutinised as a full planning application. So maybe we shouldn't worry too much. I don't know. Moving on, we mentioned earlier that Manchester City Council put an Article 4 determination on the city banning office to resi conversions. Might they do a similar thing to prevent Class E to resi conversions, Victoria?
Well, yes, watch this space. I think it's anticipated that the councils will start putting Article 4s in place after the 1st of August. I think it's really interesting, we've touched on the politics here and almost that power struggle between government, national government, and local councils, where the government is giving power with one hand, and then the councils on the ground are sort of taking it away with the other. And you've got the struggle between the government want this, the councils are saying no, we want this. We're on the ground, we know what's better, we've got a local plan, as Justine said. It almost does seem to circumvent the council's going to the time and trouble, a lot of expense of having a local plan in place by having then unplanned housing everywhere. So yes, I would expect that you are going to see Article 4s coming to force. However, it's also been consulted upon the changes to the National Planning Policy Framework that's actually going to set the threshold higher and make it much more difficult for councils to put Article 4 directions into force.
Okay, so it's interesting. This is the local council's way of fighting back against a nationally imposed thing. We'll try, and we're coming towards the end. It's been a good discussion, and hopefully everyone listening has enjoyed it. Let's throw the eye forward a little bit now and think about what our town centres might look like in the future. We're at kind of a tipping point. It seems, after the pandemic and everything, with these changes to planning rules coming in, we could be about to see town centres change, in a more drastic way than we've seen for many, many years. Justine, we'll start with you. What changes do you expect to see in town centres going forward as a result of the changes we've spoken about today, particularly in light of more people working from home? Should we be worried, do you think, or excited about the future?
I think probably the fact that the new use Class E will, provided there are no restrictive planning conditions, as Victoria's just mentioned, will allow kind of buildings to change between the different uses flexibly and at different times of the day. So I think that could be a really good thing, because it could kind of help businesses to sort of diversify and adapt to the post-COVID world. By offering, a wider variety of uses without having to keep going back and changing the planning consent. Because, planning has traditionally been seen as very kind of inflexible. So I think that probably is helpful. But it's probably fair to say as well that some of our high streets are kind of potentially at risk, where residential development has a higher value than some of the other uses within use Class E. Although some residential development is good in these kind of areas, because they'll provide a footfall to support the businesses that are still there. But if there's kind of no safeguards in place to protect shops and businesses at the ground floor level, in theory we could see some high streets wiped out. One thing that's quite bizarre about the regs are that that there's a stipulation that where a conversion is proposed at ground floor and it's in a conservation area, the loss of the retail frontage has to be considered. So that may in effect mean that town centres in conservation areas end up being better protected, which I know Victoria did mention, because there's no kind of requirement to consider that impact when you're not in a conservation area.
Okay.
And I think, for a long time, there's been, a real drive to conserve the vitality and viability of town centres through planning policies. And so, maybe the proposals could, potentially erode that to an extent. However, in areas where there, is a, say, an oversupply of offices, a move to residential could actually be a good thing in these kind of areas. So, should he be worried or excited? I don't know. I don't think it's not clear yet. It'll be interesting to see what the take-up is.
Yeah, absolutely. And Victoria, anything to add on that? Give me some positivity, please.
Yeah, well, see, I think that the new Class E to residential has actually opened up the planning system for developers and property owners who now have much more flexible and potentially profitable spaces. So, for example, if you had a gym which was in previous use class D, these are now within use class E, and so those developers now can have a slice of the permitted development right pie, but it's not just those property owners who have offices who can now, take advantage and actually change to a much more profitable use. I think the winners are likely to be those owners of medium-sized retail units. I think that, really large retail units are going to struggle to, even with a sort of a partial conversion that you're allowed to do, just on a practical basis. I think what's also really important to remember is we are talking about town centres, but a retail park, all of those units within a retail park, they're within Class E. So actually, are they going to be affected? Are we going to see the loss of out-of-town shopping? I mean, I would doubt it, because particularly during the pandemic, out-of-town retailers flourished. But it's really important to sort of not lose focus or not lose sight of the fact that this is not just town centres that are going to be affected. And I do think, I think I'm the same as Justine. I think it's going to be really, really interesting to watch this space. Now, just going back to Eric Pickles in 2013, his rationale for bringing in office to residential was, one of the things included was to reinvigorate the high street, and yet we're still in a position in 2021 where the high street needs reinvigorating. Is this going to do it? I don't know. I really don't know. But I do think we have to, again, not lose sight of the fact that post-pandemic, the high streets really do need a shot in the arm. They really do need something drastic to happen. And actually, therefore, is a drastic change to the planning system going to be that, shot in the arm that's needed? Maybe.
Fantastic. What a brilliant place to end. Yeah, absolutely. Let's watch this space with interest and curiosity. It'll be fantastic and fascinating to see what goes on, and how our high streets are going to look going forward. Thank you both so much for joining me today as experts on this topic. I've learned a lot. Hopefully everybody who has listened has also learned a lot. So thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening to this Place Northwest podcast. To inquire about anything that was discussed today or talk about your planning options with Victoria, please email victorialeam@kites.com. For more information on Kites and the services it offers, please visit www.kites.com.